if the FIA make radical changes to the technical regulations before the Australian Grand Prix, which affect the way Mercedes and maybe Red Bull Powertrain have done their power unit with the compression ratio, will all the Mercedes teams band together and go on strike? I wonder what you thought of that prospect, Mark. I don't think it's going to happen, but I can't imagine Flavio would join that, would he?
Probably not, but it sounds pretty unlikely, to be honest. But hopefully we won't get put into that situation. But it's an interesting situation, isn't it, whereby under the old rules, or the way things used to be years ago, there's no way we'd even be contemplating that. You know, they'd come up with a technical advantage and they'd be allowed to run it for a period of time, no doubt. Nowadays, with the desire to keep the cars as close together as possible, there seems to be more of a desire to clamp down on things. So we'll see how that pans out. But I think it would be a tragedy if that did happen and they weren't able to use what they've developed.
And just thinking practically and more realistically, I suppose, if it is deemed that they've found this loophole and it's not going to be closed for 26, what do you think they will do for 27? Do you think they will change the ambient temperature clause? Do you think what will they do?
Well, they'll either have to introduce monitoring across a wider temperature range, the working temperature range of the engine, or they'll just change the point at which it's measured. But I just think the questions I have are, why did they change the specification in the first place? Because previously this wasn't an option, as I understand it. It just seems a strange situation to have been allowed to develop. But also, why didn't the other engine manufacturers spot what was a very obvious change to the regulations and do something about it?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point as well. Just one of the other questions that came up in the previous live stream, I feel I owe it to TQ4ZAP, that was the name, who asked about the indentations on the side of the AMR26 Aston Martin nose. That's a question I put to Craig Scarborough. And we've actually got a picture here of Scarbs did an annotation you can see under the bib of the nose there. And he says in reply, the deep bulge under the nose speeds up the airflow along the bodywork, which is probably part and parcel of the concept of the deep undercut Adrian Newey side pods, feeding the diffuser. This feeds the diffuser and the slot in the side of the diffuser. So yeah, good question. And I think that Scarbs is probably right on it there in terms of what that was. But yeah, look, we haven't really seen all the details yet of the Aston Martin, and we will certainly be getting Scarbs back fairly soon to go through a lot of unfinished business with all the new cars. Let's get on to some questions, Mark, because there's a whole bunch of questions here. Sarosh Soman, one of our regulars, thank you very much indeed for joining the show. Sarosh, hi Peter, hi Mark. Looks like many people are not expecting McLaren to be at the top. I'm guessing that's because in 09 and 14, when there was a big rule change, reigning champions didn't do well. Interesting point. What would you say about that, Mark?
They produced arguably the best car last year, and certainly at the end of the previous season. So they've got a very strong technical department, and they've got the Mercedes engine, which, if all the rumours are correct, is probably the best power unit, subject to regulation. So I think there's every reason why they should be in a stronger position as they were before. They're a good team, and they seem to be in a good place in terms of the way they function. So I would expect. I mean, there's going to be a little bit of variation amongst the teams, but I wouldn't like to predict which way that's going to go. But I see no reason why McLaren shouldn't be one of the contenders for top car at the start of the year.
Yeah, and very different team as well, isn't it, from those years too? So nothing unusual there, really.
2009 for McLaren was that was really the end of the Adrian Newey era of 2008, because although he'd left the team in 2006, the car that we ran in 7 and 8 was effectively the evolution of his car. And then the regulations changed for 2009, and that car was initially an absolute disaster. But it was an entirely different car. bore no relation really to the previous car, and Adrian leaving meant that at that time McLaren were actually had a bit of a vacuum in terms of aerodynamic understanding, and the dire performance of the 2009 car reflected that.
Yeah.
I wasn't there in 2014, so I can't really comment on anything. I suppose he's referring to Red Bull going into 2014, and that was largely they had a very good car, as demonstrated by the fact that Ricciardo managed to win a few races, even with the Renault engine, which was absolutely appalling in 2014. Having worked at Renault at that time with the same engine, it just blew us away that he was actually able to win races, because we were in all sorts of trouble. So I think the car, certainly the Red Bull car in 2014, was a fantastic car, just let down by a poorly performing engine at that time.
Yeah.
So they're all different circumstances.
Hi, Peter from Singapore. Hi there, Ronnie. Many thanks for your insightful views on Formula One that keep us interested. Well, thank you very much. Could you explain how the energy recovery and deployment are being used in this new format? Well, there's a simple question for you, Mark.
Yeah.
Well, it's what we wanted to get onto. I mean, first of all, what's the driver's job when he's trying to recover energy? What are the things he can do or can't do, and what will some drivers do better than others?
So to recover energy, the kinetic energy generator effectively has to be driven. It has to be powered. So it's either powered by effectively the momentum of the car when it's not being driven forwards by throttle. So off throttle, it's being driven by the rear wheels, the car slowing down. And then you can also power it from throttle effectively. So instead of the throttle being used to generate acceleration, it can be used to create electrical energy. So the drivers will have to learn how to. Well, the other thing that's important is that although the cars will be allowed 8.5 megajoules of energy deployment in a lap, 9 megajoules if they've got the override or overtake detection. The swing of the battery, so from maximum to minimum on the energy level, is only going to be 4 megajoules. So that means that the driver will have to recover the 4 megajoules that's available plus another 4.5 to 5 megajoules to have the full amount of energy that's allowable for him to deploy during a lap. So that means recovery is going to be necessary. So it's going to be, he will, how he drives the car will determine how much energy he recovers. The main thing will be to lift off end of straight or into corners, so that as much of the braking as possible is transmitted back to the MGUK to generate electricity. If he uses the brakes, so it will be distributed between the MGUK and the rear brake pads and discs. And obviously, ideally, as little use of the discs and pads as possible will be preferable to recover energy. But that means setting a brake balance which he can manage is going to be difficult. So the more recovery you got from the rear axle, the better. But if you overdo the amount of recovery from the rear axle, it'll make the car very unstable. So he's going to need to be able to operate with as much recovery from the rear as possible. And that's going to be very much dependent on the driver. Some drivers like a car that's very, very stable under braking. And that effectively means more of the braking being done by the front axle than the rear axle. Whereas if a driver can accommodate a rear axle that's closer to the limit and so get more recovery from that rear axle, then potentially they're going to have an energy advantage. And then it's going to come down to the teams. I suspect will have some ability to determine how much energy recovery is done on the straights by limiting the power that's going to the rear wheels and diverting it to energy recovery. And then there will also be on partial throttle on acceleration. Potentially the throttles can be opened more than the driver effectively wants in a way that diverts some of the power to generating electricity and not to the road wheels. And the driver will have an input into, through the practice sessions, of how happy he is with those modes. But I think once the qualifying or the race starts, you can't actually change those modes significantly. So I think it's mainly going to come down to, as I say, how much retardation from the rear axle he's going to be able to accommodate and how much lift and coast he's going to be able to perform, really. I'll be honest, I don't fully understand it myself at this stage. I haven't spent enough time looking at the regs and understanding the ramifications of it. But basically, to generate electricity, the MGUK needs to be driven by either the energy from the momentum of the car, or from the use of the petrol, shall we say, to determine electricity. There's no simple way around that.
Well, we're all wondering what graphics we're going to see on screen. I mean, what graphics the driver's going to need to see with the precise kilojoule numbers as well.
Yeah, I mean, it will. We used to have a bar chart on the dash display, which would basically show the maximum min energy, and he doesn't need. The problem for the drivers will be if he goes out of the regions, if he overuses it, then he just won't have energy to accelerate with at the next corner. He'll be in deficit, and the amount of extra recovery will mean that he'll have less power around the rest of the lap. So he's going to have to basically keep an eye on that bar chart or whatever graphic the teams use to make sure he doesn't go into a negative territory. And I'm sure there's going to be an absolutely huge amount of radio conversation between the driver and his engineer about how he should be managing that. And I'm sure they will have different amounts of recovery mode available that they'll be able to use. But when I said that they won't be able to change the maps, what I mean is they won't be able to change the throttle's contribution. So for a given amount of throttle, the engine will do what it has to do, and that won't be, I suspect, that won't be modifiable. So yeah, they're going to have to be alert to where they are around the lap, and they had to be alert to that last year to a certain extent, but it's just going to be a much bigger factor in how they drive now, because, as I say, the amount that is deployable from the battery without any recovery is less than half the amount that is available for a lap. So if they don't manage it properly, they're going to lose quite a bit of lap time. And that makes it a lot more challenging for the driver. And then this whole issue of the overtake mode and having the extra energy available and when to use it is another thing they're going to have to understand. And we'll see how that goes. But basically, the smarter drivers, the more race savvy drivers, will be the ones who latch onto these things more quickly. And as I mentioned to you off air, I think if anybody has got a simulator that allows a driver to simulate racing, if they've been able to get into that over the winter and effectively pretend to race and learn how the car behaves in that situation, then I think they'll have quite a big advantage. So for me, I think in qualifying, it's not going to be such a big challenge for them because it's just a one lap. But when it comes to the racing, I think the management of that energy through the race, that's going to be quite a big differentiator between drivers, I suspect, and also between power units. So if one power unit is doing a better job of managing that recovery than another, then that will be amplified in the race situation, whereas it might be less obvious in qualifying.
At the beginning,
Yeah.
Mark, correct me if I'm wrong here. Did you say the throttle can be used not necessarily for acceleration? Did you say a phrase like that
Yeah.
when we were talking about
So
harvesting? Yeah.
at part throttle, as I understand it, and again, I'm not going to pretend that I'm fully up to speed with this, but that some recovery of energy is allowed at part throttle, and that would only be possible by effectively opening the throttles more than the driver requires to drive the generator, rather than providing power to the rear wheels effectively. So it's channeling some of the power from the combustion engine into electrical power generation.
But what does that mean? What does that mean around Rascasse
Well,
at Monaco?
well, it just means that the driver will apply a certain amount of throttle, but it will be mapped so that the the MGUK is effectively working as a generator. So it'll be resisting the power coming out of the internal combustion engine. So it'll be absorbing some of that power. It'll be effectively like having a brake on, but the driver won't feel it. It'll just be a diversion of power, extra power than he needs to generate electricity. So to him it will feel normal. He'll just be driving to the limit of traction. But when there's more power available from the ICE than the rear wheels can take, some of that power will be diverted to generate electricity. So it's effectively burning fuel to create electricity, which is actually very efficient.
Yeah.
And the cars were doing that in the past as well. So that's not a new thing, but they'll have to do that as much as they possibly can, because if they don't, they just won't be able to generate enough energy. And as I understand it, most circuits, even with the best sort of power generation that they can muster, the chances are they won't be able to recover the full amount of energy that they are allowed to deploy around a lap. So it is a limitation. And it's going to vary from circuit to circuit.
And that use of the throttle won't feel the same as throttle lag used to feel in the turbo days.
No. I don't think the driver will feel anything.
Right.
It's just that the amount of resistance to power delivery, so that normally comes from, aerodynamic drag, road friction. On top of that will be the generator being driven. So
Right.
it's just an extra load on the internal combustion engine. But the driver won't be aware of it. And when he reaches the limit of traction, he'll just modulate his throttle. But what's going on in the background is that some of that fuel is actually being used to generate the electricity.
Right. Got you. So Rosh, Simon, hi Peter Mark. Understand that Lewis was saying the car is snappy and oversteery, which is also what Mercedes was saying yesterday, actually, but it's easier to catch in comparison to the previous generation ground effect. Your views, please. And just before you start, Mark, it was interesting at the end of yesterday to see Antonelli, because they had some sort of issue with the front suspension on the Mercedes, involving a hammer, I think, in the garage at one point. But it was interesting right at the end to see Antonelli taking unbelievably, ridiculously wide entry lines into the corners, way over the curbs on the left, going into a right-hander, what Piero Taruffa used to call the transitory curve. I hope they're not going to be doing that everywhere. And I wonder whether he's just trying to get the front suspension dislodged or something, or trying to free it up doing all that, bumping over those curbs the way he was. It seemed very odd. But anyway, yeah, there is already a sort of some teams suffering from snappy oversteer. Thoughts, Mark?
Well, as I said, I think they will need to be operating the rear axle as close to the limit as possible to get the recovery. That means that the cars on the entry phase will be at the limit. It's not really new, because that's always been the limitation, really, on car performance. But there's sort of an extra emphasis on it, because now it will determine how much energy recovery they get, let alone just the driver having confidence to enter the corner. So I think initially the engineers will be trying to push that more, and the drivers will be unhappy about that in terms of balance. And I think they'll find that they'll have to back it off, because ultimately, if they make a car unstable on corner entry, the driver just won't have the confidence to push it, and he just won't be as quick. So they're going to have to probably be less aggressive with that than they might want to be. In terms of general snappiness, well, the cars have just got less grip than they had before, so they're going to feel less stable potentially. The aero should be a bit more benign in response to sort of lateral sliding than it was with the ground effect cars. So it might be that the snaps are a bit less violent than they were before. But I think we're talking in relative terms, because these are Formula One cars after all, and basically everything they do is violent and aggressive compared to what we normal humans would understand.
But it strikes me that guys like Max and Charles, who are very good at dealing with a flicky rear end, an
Yeah,
unstable rear end, more than most, are going to
yeah,
be in quite good shape, therefore, in getting the rear axle to work.
I would agree. Yes, I think a driver who can cope with that sort of behaviour is going to have an advantage. I mean, I think they would have had an advantage in the past, but I think
Well,
arguably
now it's a
that
double
advantage.
whammy because they get the advantage on
Yeah,
power, right? Effectively,
exactly,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
So
subsequent power.
yeah, whereas a driver who likes a nice, smooth performing car. So the ultimate example, you might say, an Alain Prost might struggle with this current generation of car more than would have been the case
Yeah,
previously.
yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting question now from Aaron. Hi, Peter and Mark. Will much higher top speeds mean taller overall gearing? What impact will this have over driving the rest of the lap? But bear in mind now, because the cars are slower, we're seeing more cars using, say, first for turn 10 in Bahrain than before, when most cars used to use second. So on the one hand, you're going taller at the top end, and the bottom end, you're going shorter, really.
Yeah, I mean, the gear ratios are fixed for the whole year.
Yeah.
So,
For the whole year, or is it once a year you can change it?
uh, so when this was first introduced back in 2014, there was one change allowed in the first year, and that was just in case people thought they'd made a mistake, basically in
Okay.
their predictions. But that was not allowed subsequently. Um, I don't know whether that's been changed for this year, and maybe there is an allowance for a change during the season. I'm not aware of that. Is possible, but in the past, on many circuits, the cars didn't use all the gears that were available, because basically they didn't you had to have an eighth gear that was good enough for Monza and Baku, and that meant at Monaco you never got into it, and that will still be the case. Whether the shorter gears, so first gear has got shorter, I'd be surprised, because that's mainly for the start of the race. Maybe second gear's changed, so the spread of ratios may have changed a little bit, but I'd imagine it's not too dramatic. The difficulty that they've got now, obviously, is that the drag levels of the car is reduced, and the peak power is the same, but the end of straight power is actually lower, because of the way this electrical energy is diminished as the speed increases. So this year, a car doing 345 kilometers an hour has only got about 540 horsepower, which is actually less than it would have had last year, when it would have had more electrical energy available, or you would have had some electrical energy available and more from the internal combustion engine. So the fact that the speeds are going to be higher will only be when they're in the override mode and they have the full electrical power available, if they've still managed to save enough energy to deploy that. And because the cars have less downforce, therefore they've got less drag. And because of the energy regulations, there is a desire to run maybe less drag this year than would have been the case last year in any case. So I'm not sure how much quicker the cars will actually be. I suspect that they won't be that much quicker at peak, but they're not often going to be in that zone. But the gearing has to accommodate that. So yeah, they'll just have to play around with the gaps between the gears to manage that. And it probably does mean slightly bigger steps between the other ratios. But it's the same for everybody, and I doubt it's going to be a massive player in the driving, to be honest.
Alessandra Durango, another good question. Hi, Peter, Mark. How significantly will the new regulations affect race starts?
I think it won't make a huge difference, other than obviously the cars have less grip from the narrower tyres, and I, I think the regulations regarding mapping of the throttle might be a bit more restrictive. So I'm not sure if it used to be that we used to map the throttle to be sort of flatter initially and then more aggressive later on to try and make it so that the drivers had a slightly easier time as they're trying to manage the throttle. So I don't know, but it's possible that that's got a little trickier. I know that electrical energy isn't deployable until I think the car reaches, I think it's 50 kph. And I think that'll be to avoid the teams playing games in terms of maybe applying some sort of effective traction control through the electrical deployment.
They
But
wouldn't do that, surely. That's cheating.
yeah, but I, I suspect that it's not going to be a huge factor. I think it's just that with a little bit less grip, the drivers will find it a little bit more tricky to put the power down. But I think they'll get on top of that fairly quickly. So I don't think it's going to be a huge player in that area, to be honest.
Next question will make you laugh, I think, Mark. It's about why we don't have horns on the car. Quite good in qualifying or the rain. Seriously, what do we think about the engine note of the car, the new cars? And how
Uh,
loud is that from a driver's perspective? Will he notice any change, do you think?
they probably will note a little bit of a change. From what I've heard, and it's always difficult through a microphone because you don't know how that microphone's been tweaked to make it sound more aggressive. Because I guess most of what we've heard so far has been sort of through official channels, and there's obviously a desire to make the car sound louder. But until you stand at the side of the circuit, it's difficult to know if that really is true or not. But they sound a little bit more aggressive. But again, I don't think it's going to be a huge factor. But you remember, louder noise just means less efficiency. So, but unless it's just tuning of the exhaust pipes. Anyway, to the drivers, I don't think it will make a huge amount of difference, to be
Why
honest,
does louder noise mean less efficiency?
because you're just turning efficient energy into noise instead of into power, aren't you? Effectively.
Hmm.
So, I mean, that's why turbos make engines quieter, because you're spinning up a wheel inside, and that's pushing air into the engine. So you're using the energy to create power, but it just muffles the sound. But that effectively a louder sound is just, it's like heat. The more heat that comes out, the more noise that comes out. It's just effectively a little bit wasted energy.
Mm,
Um,
fair enough.
yeah,
Give you that.
it's just efficiency, really.
Um, Lots of welcomes here. Thank you very much. Alexandra Miguel says, "Hi Peter, loving your live sessions. What do you think about Portimao returning to Formula One? Did Estoril produce better races? Don't know about better races, but good races for sure. Estoril was a very good racetrack. I always felt good test circuit too, for that matter. Lots of different corners and some good overtaking places. Just a great racetrack. Yeah, Portimao is a good circuit too. I mean, your thoughts on Portimao and Portugal in general, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, the first time we went there, the grip was incredibly low. Can't remember what year that was. That was 2012 or 13, and they actually had to abandon the test there because the grip was so low.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
When we went back in, it was 2020, wasn't it? It was one of the sort of emergency circuits for the shortened season. Yeah, it was fine. I mean, I have to say nothing particularly stands out for me as to how good, bad, or indifferent it was. In as much as it wasn't obviously a boring track. I mean,
Hmm.
I hate to say it, but Abu Dhabi is a particularly dull track, shall we say? And I don't
We will
remember
say, yeah.
Portimao didn't appear to be as bad as that. It was fine. It had
Mm.
some elevation changes and some nice corners. Yeah, I thought it was a good circuit, and ultimately it's only money that meant that it wasn't back on the schedule subsequently, as far as I know. But and Portugal, it's a very nice country and good food. Nice to be on the coast. Wind was a big factor from what I remember, and it certainly used to be a big factor at Estoril when we used to test there. And the proximity to the Atlantic meant that rain wasn't out of the question as well, particularly in testing. So yeah, I'd say they're proper circuits, aren't they? That throw the challenges that you want thrown at cars and drivers and engineers, unlike some of the sort of more manicured tracks.
Yep.
Shall we say?
Yep, I'd agree with that. Bo Sinclair, good morning, everyone. 5:15 here in Kansas City. Well, good luck. Thanks very much for joining us, Bo. And question from you: are the cars going into straight line mode and cornering mode automatically, or do the drivers have some control over it?
So the driver has to activate the straight line mode in the same way that he used to activate DRS, and then when he presses the brake pedal, it'll be deactivated. And if he wanted to, he could manually override that and deactivate the mode sooner. So, for instance, at Suzuka, when you've got a fast corner at the end of the start-finish straight leading into a tighter corner, the drivers used to have to deactivate the DRS manually. Otherwise, they'd have an accident because they're not pressing the pedal, basically, for that first kink. So it was necessary for them to manually deactivate. And obviously now that we've got lower downforce cars than we had last year, then there may be some other corners on around the circuits where they have to manually deactivate. But you can do a bit of, you can just point out to a driver if he's a little bit slow on picking up on that. But we're talking about, 1 or 2 hundredths of a second. So it's not going to be a big differentiator between drivers, I'd imagine, as to how good they are at activating. It'll come down more to whether each team's activation, one team's is more effective than another's. We've seen some variation in how the teams are activating the rear wings. So most of them are doing it as DRS, so where the front edge of the rear flap lifts up to create a bigger slot gap. But Audi appear to be rotating their flap sort of around a middle position, and the Alpine appeared to be dropping the rear edge of their flap down to a lower position and not moving the front of the flap. So there's a little bit of variation there. And as we mentioned in the previous section of the show, we've got most of the teams backing off the second and third elements of their front wings, but you've got Aston Martin and Aston Martin Mercedes just backing off the third element of their front wing. So there could be some variations in the amount of drag they lose. So that might be somewhat of a differentiator between the teams.
Mm. Well, let's just hope none of it goes wrong, is all I can say. As soon as you've got these additional things on the cars, there's always the potential for things to go wrong. And in theory now, it's an even worse result because it's front and rear wing. So we don't even really want to go there now, do we? It's all happening, and that we just got to assume that everything will work perfectly.
Yeah, I mean, the rules do say that if the modes fail, they should fail into the safe position, i.e. the high drag position. But trouble is, when parts break, you can't necessarily guarantee that's going to happen. We had a problem with Nico Renault in, which year was it? It was either 17 or 18, I think, where his rear wing flap broke, the fish plate at the end broke, and it jammed it in the open position. So we had to retire the car because, you couldn't drive the car with the DRS effectively open all the time.
Bit like the headlights of the Lotus Elan, which Colin Chapman designated if they do fail, should fail with the lights still up, so you can see where you're going. Didn't always work though, got to say.
No, there's no way you can guarantee it.
Semtex just giving us an update on the Red Bull issues this morning in Bahrain. Hydraulic problem. Hadjar left the pit lane in the last minutes of the morning session. Expected to head out in the afternoon. I hope so. Are the cars going to be able to follow one another? We kind of dealt with that in the first live stream. And obviously it depends on a lot of things, doesn't it? But in theory, they should. What's it going to be like following another car when you've got all the wings down, front and rear? What is it going to be? Even less turbulence than we've had in a long time, do you think? On the straight,
I think so. On the straight, there will be. Well, the drivers wouldn't have noted a big amount of turbulence in the straight line previously, they'd have just noticed that they got effectively sucked along by the car ahead. And that should be less strong now because the cars have less drag and less turbulence. So the chances are there's going to be less of a tow from the car ahead. Where it's meant to help with the current regulations is in the sort of high-speed corners in particular, or medium-speed high-speed corners, where there should be less messy turbulence shed by the car ahead, affecting the downforce of the car behind. And so it should be possible for that car to stay closer. But I think that will definitely be the case to start with. But as usual, as the aerodynamicists of the teams learn how to manage that, the performance of their cars, they'll still be looking to achieve the same things they achieved before, which is pushing the wake from the front wing and the front wheels outboard if possible to affect the floor performance less badly. They'll still be trying to do that, and who knows what they'll be able to find. Maybe they'll be able to find a way of overcoming the intent of the current regulations, and so we'll drift back towards a situation where the cars become more of a problem. I think it's going to be much, much more difficult, but we'll see. But certainly initially, I think they should be easier to follow. Yeah.
Gandalf the Fool, question from Mark. Has any Formula One team ever considered using Vortex Tube to control tyre temperatures? Vortex Tube is a pure mechanical device that spits cold air on one end and hot air on the other.
It's not something I'm aware of. So
it doesn't sound as if it would be legal either, does it?
If you're trying to just, if it's not a device that moves, that just creates vortices, then there's no moving parts. So that is in theory a legal thing. But in terms of how you would apply it to tyre temperatures, I'm not sure. I'd say it's just something I'm not familiar with, and I'm not an aerodynamicist, so I wouldn't know how you could do that.
I'm not sure this question sounds ridiculously complicated, but anyway, Mark, I'll have a go. Do Formula One teams implement optimization methods such as gradient descent and genetic algorithm in their design, given how complex cars are nowadays?
Since I don't fully understand what's meant by that, it's difficult for me to say. All I can say is that...
Is that verging on AI?
I pass. I'm not sure.
No.
If it's just in terms of does the simulation tool have gradient of the track built into it, then yes, it does. If you're referring to some sort of analytical mode, then I don't know. It's as simple as...
You're a race engineer, mate, aren't you? That's what you are. Very, very good race engineer.
I'm an old race engineer. So,
but as a matter of interest, though, Mark, have you ever done any design yourself?
Many years ago, I started as a design engineer. So, I myself and a chap called David Brown, who's not the chap you know, he went on to be a race engineer at Tyrrell.
Yeah, no, I know another David Brown though. Yeah, but go on.
Yeah, we were for a year. We were in charge of the development of the Renault Formula 3 car, and when I subsequently left Reynard's and ended up at McLaren, I was a hydraulic and engine ancillary design engineer working under Tim Goss, who's now hill director at whatever Racing Bulls are called these days.
VCARB.
Yeah. VCARB, yeah.
Yeah. Good.
So, yeah, I did a bit of design, but not sort of conceptual design of aero or suspension, shall we say.
Oh, you'll have to next show. You'll have to bring on an original Mark Slade drawing.
They're all owned by the teams that I worked for.
I'm sure Neil Oatley can go and find your drawings in the back of the old.
I got told off by Neil Oatley for my poor standard of lettering on a drawing once. When I say told off, obviously, with Neil being a very quiet guy, you don't really get told off. You're just sort of left in silence, and the
Well,
silence is enough for you to understand that you've let him down. And I was mortified
well,
because
I can
Neil's
imagine Neil. I
drawings
can
were,
imagine. Well, Mark, quite
yeah.
difficult, quite
N-
difficult to read
n-
what's going on here.
no,
It's
I just like
not
to take
really
the
our
opportunity.
standard.
What a fantastic person Neil Oakley is.
It is.
The most beautiful drawings you could possibly
Yeah,
imagine. I mean, they were
beautiful.
works of art.
Mm.
I would happily have a Neil Oakley drawing on my living room wall. They were so stunningly beautiful. I remember going into his office and he had a drawing of exhaust pipes for a Honda V12 that he was doing on his drawing board, and it was just mind blowing how good it was. Absolutely phenomenal.
And like all these people, a complete maniac on the road, a completely different person. Remember him? I think
Okay,
he rolled a Cooper S or something like that, or one of the
I
first
never
Minis near the
went to
factory at
Cheltenham.
Williams.
Yeah, so I saw him pull up at Silverstone a couple of years ago. He had a nice Alpine sports car.
Yeah, no, he's a
Horrible.
good man.
Yeah,
And Neil's not only is he a great engineer and a great designer with a wonderful hand, but he's got a great racing brain as well as a
yep,
race engineer. But on top of that,
yep,
he's an historian. I mean,
yep,
he's very, very good on Formula One history. And I'm
yep,
talking,
yep,
Achille Varzi to Luigi Musso.
yep.
He's got it all.
Oh,
And
he's
it,
legendary in
he
my
is.
opinion. Yes.
Interestingly, I once asked him what he thought. I don't remember what I phrased the question now. It was either what was the greatest Grand Prix car of all time, or what was his favourite Grand Prix car of all time. Anyway, the answer was the 1950 Alfetta. I
Okay.
said, really? And he said, yeah, because they were so ahead of their time. He said it was sort of March engineering of 1950, and they went production with it. It was just a brilliant car.
Mm.
So I thought, well, okay, fair enough. I'll accept that from Neil. Yeah, but he was, of course, Carlos Reutemann's race engineer for many years,
Yep.
and Carlos was not a man of many words either. So a
No.
lot of their debriefs were just sort of expressions and shrugs and frowns, and that was about it. As you
I,
could, a bit like you and Kimmy probably, and you and Mika.
uh, yeah, yeah. Mick was quite animated in the office, to be
Yeah.
honest. He just wasn't there for very long, but when he was there, he talked quite a lot, and he was incredibly indecisive.
And was he?
Um, so
That's always a
you'd
good
offer
sign.
him solutions, and you just spend the whole time going round in circles because he'd say, "Well, this is the problem," so you'd offer him a solution to that problem, but then he was smart enough to say, "Oh, but then that's going to be a problem here, isn't it?" And you'd say, "Yes, that will make it worse there." And then he just wouldn't. But then he said, "Yeah, but and that can't happen." Okay, well, we can't do as much of that as you want then. Yeah, but then I'm going to have the original problem again. It's like, yeah, well, and the worst thing
I
was
love it.
discussing gear ratios with him. It was an absolute nightmare, and I used to actually have to walk away. Um, Having given him a solution, then Adrian would come in and start chatting with him about something else, and I would actually have to go away and just sort of calm down a little bit because I'd have got so worked up about him not making a decision, and then the mechanics would come through and say, "We've got to have some ratios in the car now. What are we going to do?" And hopefully he'd have sort of accepted that what he wanted, which was perfect, wasn't achievable, and we'd have to choose one or the other. But yeah,
I think being indecisive is a huge quality by being left-handed, isn't it? Because
yes,
Frank was indecisive, and so was Jim Clark. I mean, Jackie Stewart has all these stories of pulling up in the middle of America when they were driving together to some Can-Am race or whatever. Not a Can-Am in Jimmy's day, of course, whatever it was called back then, the big sports car races near Riverside. They're out in the desert and there's sort of a crossroad with nothing for miles. And Jimmy would come up to the crossroad and look left and right and do you think it's safe to go sort of thing, and couldn't make up his mind, and often never went to the movies because he couldn't decide which movie to go and see, so he just didn't go and see anything at all.
it's
Good
funny, isn't it?
solution. Yeah, okay. I think FS Farmer plays probably sums up a lot of people's opinion. Not having front axle regen was one of the silliest things Formula One have ever done.
Uh, yeah. Uh, well, silly from a technical point of view, but then if it was what they had to do to draw in another manufacturer, then they didn't have an awful lot of choice. And yeah, it's just a question of compromise, isn't it? And being put in a corner and having to try and wriggle your way out of it. And
Mm.
that's why we've ended up with the cars that we've got, effectively.
But what about the Eddie Jordan philosophy of the manufacturers ruin the sport? It's all about the race teams.
Yeah, it's money though, isn't it? It's
You found
and
the
Eddie quite
nub of the
liked money,
problem.
so
Yeah.
I wonder how much of that view he would still have now if he was involved in the.
Yeah, true. Well, I think Eddie, being Eddie, if a big manufacturer had said, Eddie, we want you to come and run our operation for us and we want to pay you 100 million a year to do it, I think he'd probably say, yeah, I love manufacturers, wouldn't he?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay,
If
Gandalf
that's what they
says,
want,
this is a
yeah.
good Mark one, I think. How many details are Formula One teams able to model in CFD? Tire deformation, crosswind, cornering conditions, surface imperfection, bouncing?
Uh, so
Well, if they were, they
that,
hadn't done a very good
yeah,
job, have they?
most of it, I would say, that it's developed hugely over the last sort of 15 to 20 years, and if you remember was it the the Virgin car that was supposedly designed by CFD back in, when was that, 2010 was it, when the cars were brought in? I mean, at that time that CFD just wasn't capable of doing a good enough job, but it's a fact now that a lot of the components on the cars are defined in CFD, and the wind tunnel and the car trap running is sort of used to validate it. But in terms of the dynamic performance, that is more difficult, and I'm sure it is improving. But as we saw with the bouncing, that did pose problems to the teams, and the teams that were able to model it more effectively were the teams that made the most progress. So these things are improving all the time, and we were chatting about AI off air, but that is something that teams are definitely using heavily now to improve their modelling and simulation. So yeah, I'm sure they're all getting into it. It's a question of who does the best job will probably produce the fastest car.
FS Farmer comes back with this question about the gear ratio, saying they're using first for charging, otherwise they would still be in second. Did you not
Well,
watch Max yesterday? Yeah, I was watching Max yesterday, but that wasn't clear. I think with respect, FS Farmer, I think you're drawing a conclusion there with insufficient information, but you may well be right. I'm not prepared. I wouldn't say you're wrong, but very early days to do that. But I don't know. Your thoughts on that, Mark? Would you do that? Would you go down to first for charging?
um, it it will be beneficial to use a shorter gear in any corner. So if you can use fourth instead of fifth, or third instead of fourth, or maybe some very slow corners, if you can use first instead of second, then it should help the regen. The trouble is, obviously, if you use first gear, and you get it makes the engine performance very sharp, and if you have too much effective braking from the engine and the regen that you're trying to do, it'll just break traction. It'll cause the rear wheels to under rotate. So it'll come down to what the driver can manage in terms of drivability and response from the car. Mm-hmm. So a driver who is able to use a shorter gear or use a short gear earlier is probably going to get some benefit, and Max may well be one of the people who's able to do that. But it in some ways it comes down to the amount of torque that the engine manufacturer teams run at. So unfortunately, with all these things, it's a bit like when you talk about brake balance. Brake balance in itself isn't a meaningful thing anymore, because brake balance means a percentage of front and rear wheel braking from the brake discs and brake pads that you set. But because we're doing electrical regeneration from the rear axle, there's an amount of engine braking that is part of that brake balance. So you have to talk about axle torque balance rather than brake balance, but the terminology is brake balance. So ratios in a similar way are somewhat irrelevant, because the teams can manipulate the amount of torque that is the negative torque they have in different gear ratios to some extent. So it's not the ratio that matters, it's the amount of regen that is being done, or the amount of engine braking that you get in particular revs that matters. But the fact is that if the engine's turning over more quickly, then you should be getting more regen. So using shorter gears, if the driver can manage it, will be beneficial. But it all comes down to ultimately the amount of rear axle braking that the driver can accommodate, and then can he pick the throttle up in a shorter gear without breaking traction? That's going to be a driving limitation, shall we say, and a driver who can manage his throttle more gently to pick that up should get a benefit if he can do that. It's all very technique. It's very complicated.
Yeah. And whatever it is, of course, Max will do it quite well. There's no doubt about that. But my point about coming out of turn 10 in first or second is related to how slowly they're now going through turn 9, which is, for me, a real eye-opener as to how slow these cars are compared with 2025, because they're braking before they go into 9 now, which means they're going much slower into 10, which means that probably that's why so many guys are using first gear for 10 now, today. And so there's that. But my other point, Mark, is if in theory, if you want to save fuel for the ice, you want to change gear sooner and you want to keep the revs down. How important is it to be saving fuel relative to all this harvesting business?
That's difficult for me to say, to be honest, because I'm not being familiar with the current generation of cars and how much more of a limitation that is now. From my basic understanding, I don't think that is a huge factor. So where am I trying to go with this?
Because it's 70 litres now, isn't it?
Well, dare I say it, it's even more complicated than that.
Oh, no.
The technically, so in description, the fuel metering is now done by energy, not by volumetric flow. So the meter, it does measure the flow. It converts that into a mass, or it converts that into a velocity, which converts that into a mass flow. And then because the fuel suppliers have to give the FIA basically an energy density, the FIA regulates the energy flow. So in actual fact, two different fuels could flow at different volume flow, as long as they don't exceed the energy flow, which is regulated. So a less energy dense fuel is allowed to flow faster. So as I say, it's being done by energy flow rather than volumetric flow now. It's just more complication. The energy flow has been effectively reduced by 30%, which was something I hadn't fully appreciated previously. So the cars will start with significantly less fuel on board than they started in the past, and can use less fuel during a lap. But precisely how much is difficult to say, other than it's nominally around 30%, but it's not as simple as that. But that is a large contribution to how much lighter the cars will be at the race start.
I was going to get onto that. I mean, and what horsepower are they going to be getting off the line then from the ice?
Well, in simple terms, the cars will be producing about, and I'm going to talk in horsepower, somewhere around 500 to 550 horsepower from the ice. And then the total is around about 1,000 horsepower. So the other comes from the electrical power.
Right.
But bear in mind that I said that when the cars start from zero, they're not allowed to introduce electrical power until they've got to, I think it's about 50 kph. So initially, they've got a peak power of around 550 horsepower available, but then the engine won't be able to produce that instantaneously anyway, so they won't have that much power sort of right from the get-go.
But a much lighter car than last year, obviously, with the lighter
so
fuel.
the car is about 30 kilos lighter inherently than it was last year. Most, or a large proportion of which, is simply from lighter wheels and tyres, it has to be said. And that is actually, I believe, one of the main reasons why the wheels and tyres are smaller, is they needed to find weight.
Oh, really?
The rest of the weight saving comes from the loss of the MGUH and just whatever the teams can achieve. Well, the shorter wheelbase means that the cars will inherently be lighter. So I think that's the main area where the weight saving is coming from. And then for the race starters, I say there's another effectively around about 30 kilos saving in fuel load. So roughly 60 kilos lighter at the start of a race compared to last year, which is of some significance, but it's not quite 10%. Whereas in qualifying, the weight saving is more just the car weight saving, which is about 30 kilos.
Brilliant, Mark. Thanks so much for all this input. It's just amazing. It's a lot of it to take in, actually. It's quite difficult, but you've been outstanding in terms of what you've been able to talk about and guide us towards. No doubt things will continue to develop as we go along, but I just want to say thanks so much for the time you spent with us and for that. It's been really, really good.
Yeah, I say I'm not 100% up to speed, because
I don't think anybody is.
No, but some of it is. The rules are increasingly complicated and increasingly difficult to decipher. So I need to spend more time looking at it and more time trying to understand it. But then there will also be things that the FIA will have given to the teams in terms of technical directives, which are not available to the general public, and there will be things in that affect what they do as well, and that I'm afraid I won't be able to. I don't know what those things are, so there is going to be.
We'll find out as we go along. There's no doubt, and
yeah.
And so, can we get you back next week with Scarbs live?
Yeah, I'm very happy to do what I can and try and help people understand as much as they can, and also it helps me understand by having to explain it, because there's no better way of learning than sitting and trying to work out how to explain something, is there? That's often the way it works.
Top man, thanks so much. Big thanks again to Mark Slade, to REC Watches, to Track Ninja, and of course to Jetcraft for their support of this show and this channel. See you again soon. Stay safe.